Hello and welcome to the second of the lectures, this time on childhood and conflict. So in the first of the videos, I focused on the development of social identity and its significance in childhood, why we as social psychologists would be interested, and how it can relate to divided societies. So now in this video, I'm going to look first of all at community relations in the UK very briefly. I'm going to focus though, and the main emphasis of today's video is on social psychological perspectives, certainly fitting into community psychology perspectives as well, on reducing intergroup prejudice, and in particular we're going to focus on the contact hypothesis. Going to ask the question, what is meaningful contact? And in particular, we're going to stay for most of this video on evidence coming out of contact in schools in Greater Manchester. Just at the end, I'm just going to add a little warning that it's not all about schools, though, a little reminder. Okay, so just pointing out about the UK and community relations. So racial and ethnic diversity within the United Kingdom, about 19% of UK residents in 2015 identified themselves as racial or ethnic minorities. And this is a demographic that is skewed towards younger people. So 27% of people in state secondary schools define themselves as ethnic minority origin. Whilst we see exposure to new cultures as something that enriches life experiences, it would be remiss to not say that it is associated often with tension and with discrimination. So 25% of people in the UK believe that prejudice has grown between the year 2000 and 2013-14. Where hate crimes are recorded, then 84% of them are race related. And there's just a general sense, or I'm citing newspaper articles here, not great evidence really, but that the idea is that post-Brexit tensions and divisions are maybe becoming more increasingly evident. So how do we reduce prejudice, discrimination? Well, the traditional approach, and one that hasn't really varied very much in the last certainly 70 years since Gordon Allport first proposed it, but I imagine actually that this technique has been being used long before Gordon Allport even mentioned it in the first place, is the idea that in order to reduce prejudice between people who identify as groups is to bring those people together, i.e. contact between someone who is prejudiced towards someone of an alternative group. Bringing those two groups together should lead to a reduction in prejudice. As I say, this has been long thought out in social psychology. So Gordon Allport is known as being the first social psychologist who lays down the conditions by which contact should occur. It is not just enough to bring people together. There should be particular conditions. So you need to bring together people over time. It needs to be prolonged. You need people to work together. This is the opposite of just bringing people together for a short period of time, or just saying, you know, you two talk and then go off again. Purposeless contact. We can develop that slightly. It needs to be enduring. It also needs to be pleasant. We need to bring people together in situations where they're not in conflict to begin with. So Cook talks about the need to develop the potential that we can talk about our acquaintances, people that we know, rather than people that we met once. It's got to be around ideas of cooperation rather than competition. So something to do with common goals. This is interesting, I guess, given where we think about a lot of contact happening, say in team sports. Is bringing yourself to play another team composed of a different group necessarily the best way to produce cooperation between those two groups? Allport talks about the need to bring together people of equal social status. So Amir develops this, the idea that you're working alongside someone rather than seeing someone from a different rank, something that can challenge stereotypes maybe of non-egalitarian behaviour, i.e. not equal behaviour. And Allport also talks about, and this is going to be really important for what I'm going to mention in the rest of today's talk, it needs to occur within a framework of official support, official institutional support for integration, somewhere where legislation, but also as our leaders, act as role models for integration. So this begins to ask the question, what is meaningful contact? And I'm just going to introduce ideas around the opposite as well. What is segregation as well? So we need to move simply beyond bringing groups together. Allport is mentioning that right from the beginning. He's saying, look, it only works in particular situations. And we can begin to see situations where it appears that contact is happening. So where people and groups coexist in the same space. I've already shown you the statistics for the UK, but can we say that the UK is mixing, is supporting contact at the same rate that there is a proportion of different groups within the UK? So let's look at some of those places where you might go. You might go, look, half of that class comes from an ethnic minority background, half of that class comes from a white English or white British background. Surely that's a perfect example of mixing. Now, straight away, I've ignored some things there. I've just classed everybody who's not being classed as white British into ethnic minority. So I'm immediately guilty of some acts of ignoring difference there and ignoring notions of contact. But let's have a look even at those spaces where we might say there appears to be a lot of people from different groupings. So Williams and Porker, so Shelley McKeown, who we've already talked about in the first video slightly, notices that children in primary schools still tend to sit next to same race peers in a lunchroom. So where people are in a mixed school, but they have choice to decide who they're sitting next to, they will sit next to someone from the same race as them. And actually this can be really extended. So John Dixon really developed methods around looking at apparently mixed spaces and then just looking at who is next to who in those mixed spaces. So this is quite complicated statistics. This isn't just going, oh, I think they're all talking to each other. So he used quite strong statistical methods, but on beaches, so John Dixon particularly was looking at South Africa, where previously segregated beaches, i.e. apartheid beaches, i.e. white people were allowed to go to some beaches, black people were allowed to go to other beaches. In the post-apartheid era, who on these now mixed beaches is mixing with one another. And although the beaches look like they have both white and black people mixing, Dixon observed that actually it was clusters of white people, it was clusters of black people. The same can be observed in nightclubs, the same can be observed in schools, and in fact, with the McKeown, Stringer and Cairns references and the other reference there about universities, I'm no longer talking about race. They were looking at sectarian differences in Northern Ireland again. So they noticed how even in mixed schools in Northern Ireland, Catholics would sit together, Protestants would sit together, the same in universities. So we're looking at situations that ostensibly are mixed, but maybe when we look further aren't mixed. And I'm just going to go a little bit further and look at one study. And it's a study from 15 years ago, but I think it's really relevant for you. So this is segregation in a university cafe. The research was conducted by Beverly Clack, but she was working with a name that I've just mentioned in the previous slide, John Dixon and Colin Trudeau, actually. And they looked at this university cafe in which Beverly would walk around the cafe and note at regular interviews, not at regular stages, sorry, who was sat where. So they divided this cafe into areas. You can see here on this picture, I've divided it into distinct areas, A, B, C, D, E, and F, and there were reasons for this division. So it was just that the formal layout, and I think you get a sense of that from the division. You can see that there are clear differences in this cafe between the seating areas. So she looked at who was sitting in particular areas, and she also looked at who was just talking to who. Now, the reason that I have picked on this study is, although it's not mentioned in the paper, this study was actually conducted at MMU. So it's in a previous state. This is before the Brooks building was built, but it is still conducted in MMU cafes. Now, this is 15 years ago, but as I speak through this, I want you to consider, do you see the same patterns occurring today? So what were the findings? Well, the findings were that actually, although ostensibly MMU was a mixed university, and particularly looking at the users in the cafe, the majority of users were either white students or they were students with Asian background. There are, you might see if you look very closely on these diagrams, occasionally some other ethnic minority groups, but they were very much in the minority. So what was observed in this study was that actually there was very limited mixing at a social unit level, i.e. if you look around this, for example, this is just one time section, you can see that on the whole, white students are sat with white students and Asian students are sat with Asian students. I've just highlighted there one section where that's not quite accurate, but that's very much in the minority. But not only was it related to those social units, it was also in terms of the distinct areas of the cafe. So what Bev observed actually was that for the majority of the cafe was a white space, and then there was one distinct area that was usually populated by Asian students. So the argument here is that although there is a mixed space, both white and Asian students, we can see on the micro level that there is micro segregation occurring. Now, having talked about microsegregation, I'm going to move to probably a much larger case at the moment. And I'm going to talk through, for the majority of the rest of this video, one particular case study looking at a place not very far away from central Manchester at all, so Oldham. So Oldham is a town on the fringes of Greater Manchester. By the 2011 census, it's white by about 77.5%, with an ethnic minority population of the rest, and the majority of that population is South Asian, either Pakistani British or Bangladeshi British, and in fact other ethnic minorities are underrepresented in Oldham compared to a national average. The history of Oldham is one of textile industry, so cotton factories in particularly, and during the second half of the 20th century there was immigration from South Asia to fill textile factory positions. Since then we've seen a large decline in that industry, and so Oldham is also characterised by high unemployment and urban decline. Now, one of the reasons we're interested in Oldham, or that people became interested in Oldham, sort of government, was that it became nationally prominent in 2001 when it was a scene of serious rioting, and that rioting was divided on race grounds, so particularly involved were Asian British men and white British men, and there we saw heavy representation from the British National Party and the National Front. Police, as you will know from my crowd lectures, are also involved in any riot action. Now, the thing that makes Oldham particularly of interest to social psychologists, but also to anyone looking at community cohesion, was, and possibly still is, the large degree of residential segregation between communities. So Peach in '96 had already identified this as the highest degree of segregation of an ethnic minority population, i.e. that population being entirely separated from the majority population. And after the riots, a government report was instigated called the Cantwell Report, which was looking at the self-segregation of white British, of South Asian British in Oldham, and that report described the riots as being related to residents who live parallel lives, i.e. the different communities of Oldham were simply not contacting each other, were not in contact, with each other before those riots, apart from, I guess, when we look at this incredibly negative conflict situation. The Cantwell Report, the government report, put a focus on the integration in schools. So there was no explicit aim to segregate white and Asian pupils in Oldham. However, it was by largely de facto segregated because of the residential segregation. So because schools existed in particular areas, and because those areas in Oldham are so predominantly either white or Asian, then the schools themselves represented those areas. In the light of the Cantwell Report, actually 3 merger schools were established. So schools that were previously of one background were actually brought together with others. Now, we're going to focus on the impact of schools in Oldham. And Miles Houston, social psychologist, says that school setting is particularly important if we go back to what Allport is talking about. So Allport is talking about the structural nature of schools, i.e. they're institutional, they allow and support contact in a regular way and also in a systematic way, and we see it supported by government, and therefore it has those criteria of Allport's original contact theory. And we know that intergroup contact should be useful at a school age from the previous lecture, hopefully. So we've got references there by Rutland, the relevance of looking around and seeing your peers, the development of identity. Okay, so Houston and colleagues actually had really quite unprecedented access. So they got access to all of the 9 state schools in Oldham. And so they were able to explore intergroup contact in these schools. I mean, clearly they are recognizing that they are dealing in controversial areas. So actually, if you read this report, you will see that they repeatedly make reference to faith schools, because alongside the residential segregation, a second way that segregation may happen is that if schools particularly recruit people from a religious background, and those religious backgrounds are associated with ethnicity. So they point out in the UK as a whole, most secondary faith schools are Christian, either Church of England or Roman Catholic, although the authors do say that although the majority of faith schools are of a Christian church background, when you hear about it in the news, all of the focus seems to be on Muslim schools, and there are only 14 of those in the UK as of 2017. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 studies. Mainly, these are very traditional psychologists. They're going to be using survey methods and observational methods, so they're not going to be using the interventionary measures of community psychologists. So that I think we're going to leave into the learning activities. So the first study was one just surveying the 9 schools, and you can see here that of the 9 schools that they're looking at after we're in about 2010 at this point, there's one of them which is predominantly Asian British. There are 4 that are still predominantly white British, and then there are 4 that to some degree are mixed. I think one of those is quite controversial if you consider it particularly mixed. And we can see, reflecting Oldham, it's predominantly either white British or Asian British, so no other ethnic minorities are being involved there. So they're looking at the start of the school year and the end of the school year. So what do we see from these results? And we've just introduced some of study 2 results in here as well. Well, there's some just base measures. Asian British students are reporting more outgroup friends than white British students straight away. However, white British students in mixed schools are reporting more outgroup friends than in segregated schools, and we can relate that to the ratio in the school. So if you are in a school with a higher proportion of if you're white British and in a school with a higher proportion of Asian British pupils, you're likely to have more Asian British friends. That's not the same in segregated schools, where there's very low proportions of outgroup friends at all. We can see also they begin to look at whether this relates to other attitudes. So particularly we can see that attitudes are more favourable towards outgroups if there is greater contact occurring. So what does this study seem to show? It begins to provide empirical evidence that students in mixed schools are mixing. It's not perfect, but schools are offering a position of mixing. Now again, they're recognising the controversiality of any statement around schools, so they don't want to say that mixed schools are better than segregated schools, but they do want to say that they support contact. Now they focus again on the three, I talked about emergent schools in Oldham, so they focus again on these actual schools as well. And we can see how some of these schools are slightly different in terms of the mergers. So actually School 3 is almost predominantly white British anyway, but School 1 in particular is bringing together two almost segregated schools and putting them together. And so they're going to focus on that. And this was the most dramatic merger, and there was a great decrease in the number of students who reported having no friends from ethnic outgroups. Now again, they wanted to look at other measures as well and consider whether simply creating a school that was previously two segregated schools and bringing them together, is that enough to promote contact? Well, there was still the self-segregation that we see in seating patterns, both in the cafe and actually in classes. So this is different kinds of segregation. It's worth thinking that we don't only look at ethnic background. So gender was often segregated, although that was particularly segregated in Asian students. So Asian females tended to be separated from Asian males as well, whereas there was more mixing between white males and white females. But across the time, there was more integration, and that seemed to actually increase over the years. So they're not arguing that this is the only solution, that bringing schools together and bringing segregated schools together and mixing them in one school is actually a solution, but it is some way towards making progress. So looking at who is still in social networks, there are still distinct clusters of Asian British students, and I've hinted already that actually there was two distinct clusters of Asian British students. Boys tended to stay with boys, girls tended to stay with girls. White British students were still tended to mix with themselves, although they were more integrated by gender, but that there was increasing over time in the number of outgroup friends. So this is not conclusive support for schools as being enough to drive contact. So what are the implications of this study though? Well, there must be some role of contact playing a significant role in prejudice. It's worth saying actually that there are some theorists who even argue against contact. So for example, Becker and Tausch have criticisms of contact where they say that actually for the minority group members, when they're brought into contact and prejudice is reduced, it also, they describe it as a sedative effect. It stops the campaigning qualities as well. So you maybe just go, oh, I'll just accept that I'm in a minority position. So there are some challenges. Faith schools as a barrier to integration. So the authors here are really emphasising and trying to emphasise that faith schools aren't inherently biased or inherently segregated. However, if you draw your population from one particular part of the population, then naturally that leads to differences. They look here at how the schools have supported in some way allowing the beginnings of supportive norms between schools. However, if you're segregated, that's not going to ever be a case. It is worth remembering, of course, and I think this is again something for thinking about in the workshop or the learning activities. It's not all about schools, and I think probably Hewstone's data supports that as well. So, for example, we can look at other papers that are saying, well, school might increase contact, but it's more private forms of social norms, so maybe your family social norms that look at the positivity of that contact at a particular time. So here Mackione's stressing friendship groups and the norms within local friendship groups rather than the norms within schools. Okay, so what are the conclusions from this study? Contact theory remains a standard approach. Hewstone and Oldham study shows the role of schools as segregated spaces and as spaces that can afford contact. But I think what we've just been exploring today is the question of whether a mixed school is actually enough. So I'm just providing you here with the references that I've used in this lecture.